Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of Help Me Understand. I'm your host, MichelleFenelontv. Today, we're not sticking to sports. It's hard to put into words what we saw happened in Washington on Wednesday, so I'm going to get some help. Joining me later to help me understand what went wrong in the Capitol building is Northeastern University's Sport and Society Executive Director, Dan Lebowitz. 11 NBA games aired on Wednesday. Some teams won, some teams lost. Washington Wizards guard Bradley Beal scored a career-high 60 points. However, none of that really seemed to matter. Earlier in the day, tensions boiled over in Washington as a pro-Trump mob stormed the Capitol building. Nothing happened to them. No rubber bullets, no tear gas. They all went home or back to their hotels with their family and friends, unhurt and unharmed. While the other half of America watched and weren't shocked at all that more than 14,000 people were arrested during George Floyd protests because people were protesting for basic human rights. They were protesting that Black and brown men and women could go home without being shot in the back 7 times. What we saw, ladies and gentlemen, was what Celtics star Jaylen Brown called a split America. Take a listen.
In one America, you get killed by sleeping in your car, selling cigarettes, or playing in your backyard. And in another America, you get to storm the Capitol and no tear gas, no massive arrests, no none of that. So I think it's obvious. It's 2021. I don't think anything has changed.
Brown and other players around the league reacted in solidarity, not only because of what happened in Washington, but because just the day before, the district attorney's office said there would be no charges brought up against the officers in the Jacob Blake shooting. The Boston Celtics and Miami Heat talked about not even playing the game before deciding to do so and kneeling during the national anthem. The Milwaukee Bucks and Detroit Pistons kneeled for 7 seconds for every bullet lodged in Jacob Blake's back. Let's be very clear. What we saw was not protests. What we saw after the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and the shooting of Jacob Blake, that was protests. Golden State Warriors all-star Draymond Green put it perfectly.
Stop using the same word. It's disrespectful. It's ridiculous. And it's shameful, to keep calling them protesters.
That was domestic terrorism. Joining me later to talk about it is Northeastern University's Executive Director of Sport and Society, Dan Lebowitz. Joining me now to help me understand what exactly went wrong at the Capitol on Wednesday is Northeastern University's Executive Director of Sport and Society, Dan Lebowitz. Dan, you saw a mob storm the Capitol building. What was your initial reaction?
My initial reaction was just the variance of the way in which we respond to people based on the narrative that we create around those people. So when I watched that mob and I watched the very little resistance to that mob in many respects, almost a passageway through to the Capitol building, it's marked in terms of what we've done in this country relative to the original sin of slavery and how we have not answered that original sin on any level. And then the levels that we claim to have answered it, it was shown in the videos that you see from the Capitol, how the narratives of dehumanization that have existed around Black and brown populations for 400 to 500 years of our history really is something that you can understand the disenfranchisement cross-generationally around economics, around educational access, around trauma support and wraparound services, around economic empowerment and legacy wealth, around the only really access that we really as a country have given unfettered access to Black and brown people is a straight pipeline from school to prison. And that's not exactly the access that anybody wants. And I think that what you saw there, it's hard to look at it and not see the supremacy that is embedded in many parts of our system and how that supremacy plays out depending on the color of your skin.
A lot of people have been comparing what we saw to Black Lives Matter protests. Golden State Warriors all-star Draymond Green said, "Stop calling these people protesters." What do you call them?
Well, the bottom line is when we talk about racism in this country, we always use the word racism, or I understand the depth of that word, but we never use the word terrorism. And really, when you think about racism in the country, it has been an unfettered pattern of terrorism over generations and generations. And so, again, it's hard to look at those scenes. It's hard to think of the backdrop of those scenes. It's hard to think of that, the response versus the response to the protests in the Black Lives Matter movement, and not say to yourself that, through any lens, whether it's an empathetic lens or just a straight reality lens, there's no way that you can look at those events and not understand the depth of disparity in this country based on who you are.
You mentioned disparity. Jaylen Brown of the Boston Celtics quoted Martin Luther King Jr. and said, "We saw a split America, two different Americas." What are those two different Americas he's referring to?
I think that, you look at the privilege of being white in this country, and there is a privilege to it. And people, you find a lot of people that react negatively to that word. And yet, privilege is kind of a cleaned up word. When I look at it, I think that privilege is a clean way to say that we have a supremacy system. And we wouldn't be using such a kind word if we were talking about different populaces, because that's just, the nature of the way we've created a narrative. I think that when you look at any genocidal system throughout history and the pyramid of what genocide looks like, it starts with the dehumanization, a dehumanization narrative. And we dehumanize one population or multiple populations, we elevate a certain population. And when you look at, you look at that pyramid and you watch what happened the other day, you see that pyramid live and, in full color, and around what it looks like to have it's not just two different Americas, it's the way in which we create narratives, right? And and what we assign certain populations, the words that we assign to them. And then those words have such meaning, and they create visions. You have a vision or a view of what one population is versus another population. And what we saw is how skewed those narratives are. And, we need to address that on so many different levels. Again, on an economic level, on an educational level, on a housing level, on all types of access levels, on wraparound service levels, on workforce development levels. And, we have so much work to do in the country. And I think that one of the things we do really well is talk about problems. We don't really think about how we move towards solutions. And a fear of mine in this in the world is that there's so many platforms, and I want to make sure that no matter who you are, you're not using the platform for your own power, and you should never create self above service. How do we use these platforms to create service above self? How do we use these platforms to actually have movement towards better? What does collective betterment look like, and how do we have to start to move towards that collective betterment? And one of the ways is to identify all the disparities that come out of, the original sin of slavery, all the things that have impeded populations from access, the way that we have a system that's set up to enforce the degradation of certain populations, and how we move as a collective culture to understanding what better looks like. I think that, too often the platforms are used for branding, and they're not enough for, the reality of we can get to better, but conflict resolution and common ground, you have to first admit that there's a problem, right? And not just admit it, but admit the depth of that problem. So, I applaud the athletes. Jaylen Brown is somebody locally that, for a young kid, it's unbelievable how well he's used his voice, how he's raised the volume of that voice, but not so much in anger, rather in a way to say, how do we get to better? Let's stop and take a look at reality. Let's not try to couch it. Let's not try to pretend it doesn't exist. How do we get to better? I'm really proud of him as an athlete, just as a citizen who watches athletes and appreciates sports and understands the platform. Very, very proud of him. I'm a father. I have kids his age, and I'm awed by his ability to speak to a message, to speak truth to power, but not do it in a way where he's trying to build his own brand. He's building out a common voice of collective betterment.
Jaylen Brown has been a leader in the Boston community, being so vocal on racial and social injustice. The Celtics and the Miami Heat, initially, they had a conversation about perhaps not even playing the game later on Wednesday night. They then decided to play and use their platform. You saw different teams around the league, like the Bucks, kneeling during the national anthem. During a time like this, what role can sports play?
Well, the great thing of sport and the power of sport is it has the ability to change negative normative culture into positive normative culture, right? And so how do you do that? It's about that voice. It's about that platform. It's about the approach. It's about alerting people to real truths, and to doing so in a way that engages what the best of sport is. On a given Friday night, everybody could go to the Garden, and you could be of a different race, a different religion, a different political persuasion, a number of things. But you all have that common ground of wanting to root for the Celtics and have the Celtics win. So, if there's a commonality that can sort of weave a social fabric of conscience across a number of people, it is sport. And so that power, that ability to unify a voice for positive good, and to actually address things and find ways to find common ground, that's sport at its best.
Earlier, you mentioned white privilege and how we dehumanize one side and elevate another side. Former 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick was pretty much kicked out of the NFL because he was peacefully protesting by kneeling during the national anthem. How much of what we saw on Wednesday was white privilege?
I think all of it, right? I mean, it's not just how much, all of it was, right? And it wasn't just white privilege. It's the way in which supremacy is sort of woven into the systemic system of what America is, right? And it's not, this is a country, a great country in terms of the importance of a democracy and the importance of freedom. But you can't use the words democracy and freedom unless you're really trying to get to a better point of what democracy and freedom look like, right? And democracy, we are in the throes of changing demographics. And you can't just be a fan of democracy when the demographics are majoritatively white. Democracy is about pluralism of thought. Democracy is about conversation and in many respects, of the freedoms of elections and of voting and of all these other rights. So if in prior generations there was a white majority and people claim they loved democracy and they loved America, it's coming out that probably that love of democracy in America weren't about democracy in America. It was about a power dynamic. And I would hope that as all of us as people would embrace the concept of what democracy in America really, the hope, the promise and possibility of what it really can be. And that is that you gotta love freedom and you gotta love democracy and you gotta actually have it be freedom and democracy. And when demographics change, real truths come out, right? And the real truth is, don't call yourself a patriot. Don't call yourself a great American. Don't say that we can make America great again if basically you're trying to monopolize what that means, as opposed to understand that cultural shift and demographic shift and these things, they're part of the evolution of life. And the evolution, but we need to evolve from the original sin of slavery as a country, as a nation, as a people, as citizens of the world.
Earlier you mentioned solutions. First, you have to identify the problem, then we have to talk about solutions. This is a big question, but what needs to change?
You know, I think in many respects, like I said, when you start thinking about the toxicity of the toxicity of the world starts by narratives. I think narratives need to change, and realities about what narratives really mean. How we have a pyramid of dehumanization, and that it can be African Americans, it can be Latinos, it can be Jews. It can, we have a long history as humans of identifying populations that we want to dehumanize. And then once we dehumanize them, we can start calling them cockroaches or put all kinds of names to them. And the majority of people, rather than become incensed and outraged by that in a way that would be positive around all collective well-being, they tend to become, they look away and they allow certain forms of genocide to happen. So I would say that what needs to change is that as people, we need to understand every time that our individual ego goes up about how important we are and how unimportant other people are. Your ego goes up, your power goes down. And once the collective power goes down, you've ruined the nation and you've ruined the possibility for promise and raising all boats. We've seen, you mentioned Colin Kaepernick, and I'm very good friends with John Carlos. And I talk to John about this, almost daily, because this is a daily occurrence. And I would say that, John says to me all the time, I represented my country at the Olympics. My son is in the military. My father served. We love America. America doesn't love us. And I think that, that the way in which, and John is beautiful of person in that it's not an anger, it's a hope of why we can't get to better, why we can't have the conversations, why people refuse to have the conversations, and how we can get to better through a collective dialogue, but not just a dialogue. We're all talking about conversation, but that conversation has to lead to change agency, and that change agency has to lead to change. So we're on a continuum. It's a question of whether or not we're going to embrace the next stage of that continuum. When we look at various things, hiring practices, promotion practices, all the things that would create equality, it's time to address those issues. It's time to be real about those issues. And it's time to make the changes that we know we can make, because they're not hard solutions. They're just solutions people avoid.
My hope is that people don't look away. And like you said, not only have that dialogue, but start implementing that change. So America can actually love us. Dan, thank you so much for your insight. It's been a pleasure.
Always a pleasure to talk to you, Michelle. Stay blessed, be blessed, and keep doing your thing.
Here's my final thought. As a Black woman who went to protest against police brutality, I had an anxiety attack right before I marched the streets of Boston, although I knew I was protesting peacefully. Because I know what happened in Selma on Bloody Sunday as people protested voting rights for African Americans. Because I know what happened decades later on the streets of America in 2020. Protesters were bruised, beaten, and bloodied. Those terrorists weren't. I keep hearing people say, this is not who we are. This is exactly who we are. And the question is, do we even want to be better? That's all we have for this edition of Help Me Understand. I'm your host, MichelleFenelontv. I'll talk to you later.